Hello, early modern philosophy students. Today will be another day where I'm talking about Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics. Looking forward to doing that. Before I launch into new stuff from the prolegomena, I do want to respond to some of the student writings, just some of them that were submitted for today, where students were expected to talk about some aspect of the first Kant reading from the Prolegomena, dealing with Kant's preface and preamble to the Prolegomena. So I'll respond to some of those student writings, and then I'll move on to the first part of the main transcendental question, where Kant talks more about this, what he believes is the synthetic a priori nature of mathematics and geometry. Before getting into any of those things, also let me remind you guys that I will not be posting a new lecture for this Friday. Nobody will have short assignments to do for this Friday. You guys have term papers that are due Friday by 3 o'clock, and I'll be grading those this weekend and putting comments on them and getting them back to you. And then you could make revision to those. But do keep in mind that revised versions will be averaged against originals. So I'd encourage you to try and write the best paper you can for this Friday. And we will return to Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics, not this Friday, but the next Monday. And when we get there, I think it is the group B students will have to write something on the material that I'm talking about for today, for next Monday. But that's a ways off. I will send you guys a reading and writing assignment for next Monday at some point. But without further ado, let's get into some of the student writings for today. I thought I'd start by talking about some things that Henry Hoytje wrote about in his short assignment. Hoytje wrote the following, and maybe I should back up here and just remind you of some of the important Kantian distinctions, right? Kant says that there are, contra David Hume. Kant wants to say that there are three major kinds of knowledge, not just the two that Hume talks about. Recall that Hume says that there were two major types of knowledge: relations of ideas and matters of fact. But Kant thinks that there were three major types of knowledge. And Kant believes that Hume makes a big mistake by not recognizing a third type of knowledge, right? And Kant says that, right, he says that, look, there's analytic a priori knowledge, and this would be definitional truth that can be known without empirical evidence. And that is what Hume calls relations of ideas. Kant also says that there is synthetic a posteriori knowledge, and this is non-definitional knowledge that requires particular empirical evidence to know it. This is what Hume would call matters of fact. But Kant argues, contra Hume, that there is also the stuff that he calls synthetic a priori knowledge, right? And for Kant, synthetic a priori knowledge can be found in mathematics and geometry. And synthetic a priori knowledge, this is non-definitional knowledge, in which the information contained in the predicate of the proposition is contributing something to our understanding of the subject, which is not already there in the subject. And the synthetic a priori knowledge, it does not, right? It can be known without empirical evidence. And Kant famously argues that in math and geometry, there's a lot of this synthetic a priori knowledge. But Henry raises a puzzle about things that Kant says regarding analytic a priori knowledge. Henry expresses some puzzlement. Henry writes, and quoting from Henry says, Kant argues that all analytic views are a priori, even if the concepts are material. Kant describes how the statement gold is a yellow metal requires no experience beyond the concept of gold. Henry writes, this is a bit puzzling, as the knowledge is described as a priori, even though experience with gold is necessary. While it is true that given an experience with gold, these ideas require no additional observation, it would seem that Kant's statement is, is more in line with Hume's matter-of-fact knowledge. And so Henry seems puzzled by this, and I was led to the passage that I think leads to Henry's puzzlement. Kant writes, I'm looking at, the margin pagination number 267 from the preamble of the Prolegomena. Kant says that all analytic judgments are a priori even when the concepts are empirical. As, for example, gold is a yellow metal. For to know this, I require no experience beyond my concept of gold, which contained the thought that this body is yellow and metal. It is in fact this thought that constituted my concept, and I need only analyze the concept of gold without looking beyond it elsewhere. So what do I want to say about this? Perhaps I guess I want to try and resolve Henry's puzzlement here. I think Kant's going to say, look, the statement, right, gold is a yellow metal, that statement is analytic a priori, in the sense that if you understand the definition of gold, you see immediately that the statement is true. Knowing its truth requires no empirical study if one already comprehends the definition of gold. And I think that the passage, which I think led to Henry's puzzlement here from the Prolegomena, right? I think Kant wants to say that the concept of gold is empirical. It's an empirically informed concept, right? We get our concept of gold by observing gold. But once we understand the concept of gold, we can recognize that all gold is a yellow metal just from knowing the concept, right? And so, I think Kant's going to say, look, to know the concept of gold might initially require somebody pointing to gold and telling you that's gold, and you can but once somebody tells you that's gold and sort of ostensibly defines it for you, then once you grasp the concept, you don't any longer need to go and study gold more fully to recognize that gold is a yellow metal, for instance. And so, analogously, if, maybe somebody needs to ostensibly point to a triangle and say, that's a triangle, Johnny. But then once Johnny knows what a triangle is, understands the concept of triangle, Johnny can see immediately that any triangle is a three-sided closed plane figure, right, without having to examine more triangles empirically. But Henry goes on, and he also writes at the same time, right, he goes on and says, another question is, at what point does knowledge become a posteriori? Henry raises this question, at what point does knowledge become a posteriori? And my response to this was that, according to Kant, knowledge of the truth of a proposition becomes a posteriori when the following two conditions must be met. A, mere understanding of the terms involved in the proposition is not enough to discern its truth. And B, recognizing the truth of the proposition requires empirical evidence, right? So, for instance, I described in my outline for last time that the claim, and I might come back to this example again later, but I described in my outline last time that the statement that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 atmospheric pressure, that's something that I know, that water boils at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's a synthetic proposition because um, I I understood full well what water is prior to learning that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And somebody can full well know what water is and yet not know that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not analytic that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It is synthetic. And the truth of that proposition requires particular empirical evidence to grasp its truth, right? There's nothing, right? There's nothing in the concept of water that tells us that it will boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Rather, we have to study water and subject it to heating and measure temperature as we heat it to find out what the boiling point is, right? And so that's going to be synthetic a posteriori knowledge. So I don't know, Henry, if that helps at all, but that I don't have more to tell you on this right now. I will say this. And maybe you guys should hear this, that it is the case that when you go to 20th century philosophy and look at 20th century philosophy of language and metaphysics, these distinctions between analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge, they are challenged in the 20th century. An important figure in metaphysics and philosophy of language, Willard Van Orman Quine, he famously challenged the analytic-synthetic distinction in some of his writings. And I used to teach, philosophy of language and analytic 20th century metaphysics. And I would frequently teach Quine's famous criticism of the analytic-synthetic distinction. And so maybe some of this puzzlement that Henry is raising here might be related to some of the issues that are covered in the 20th century and addressed to some extent by Quine. I would also point out that, you notice that Kant talks about there just being three major kinds of knowledge: analytic a priori, synthetic a posteriori, synthetic a priori. And Hume says that there are just two major kinds of knowledge: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Well, famously in the 20th century, another philosopher of language and metaphysician, Saul Kripke, famously argued that there's actually a fourth kind of knowledge that Kripke calls the analytic a posteriori. This had something to do with his causal theory of reference, which was part of his philosophy of language. And so a lot of these ideas that we're working with here concerning the major kinds of knowledge, they have been famously challenged in 20th century analytic philosophy. And perhaps some of you may have the opportunity to study these things at some point in the future. But, also, granted, a lot of times undergraduates don't get into those sorts of things. I don't think it was until graduate school that I was introduced to these things, but I have taught these issues to undergraduates at Co in the past. Maybe I should go back to doing that. But regardless, I want to turn to something that Alicia Boudwani wrote in her short assignment. And perhaps these issues that Boudwani raises and Samuel Jackson, it seems to me, maybe raised some similar points. All of these points, the points made by Boudwani and Jackson, may tie in somewhat with Henry's question. Boudwani says this in reaction to Kant. Boudwani writes, "My objection to Kant is that if empirical evidence come from past experiences, then we know that 7 plus 5 equals 12 because of our past experience. For example, in math class, then we know 7 plus 5 equals 12 to be true because of the empirical evidence from our past." So Boudwani raises this issue to sort of, to challenge the idea that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is synthetic a priori, right? Kant famously maintains that 7 plus 5 equals 12 And this is just a randomly chosen example by Kant, but Kant famously says that 7 plus 5 equals 12. This is synthetic knowledge, but it's a priori, requiring no particular empirical evidence to know it. And Budwani wants to say, no, Budwani wants to say 7 plus 5 equals 12 seems to be empirical knowledge, right? Because we only know this from our past experience of what we learned in math classes, okay? Here's I wrote something in reply to Budwani. I haven't shared it with her, but I'm going to share it with you now, Alicia, and share it with the class. Look, Alicia, what I want to say is that, look, it may be that the young child needs to work with sets of objects like marbles, to count them up and add and subtract marbles from distinct sets, to initially understand the concepts of numbers and addition and subtraction, right? Or the young child might need to work with an abacus where they make a set of 5, they make a set of 7, and then they count up the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 members of this set, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 members of that set. And then they say, oh, 7 plus 5 equals 12, right? And there seems to be an empirical dimension to that. And there seems to be an empirical dimension to our learning of mathematics, right? I might have to, right, to know that 4 plus 5 equals 9, I might have to count up 1, 2. I might have to count up 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers and then count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers and then go, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 4 plus 5 is 9, right? The young child might have to start out doing math in this sort of empirically informed way. But, right, and I think Kant might concede all that, but I think Kant's going to say, but once the child understands numbers, understands the concepts of numbers, and understands the concept of addition and subtraction and multiplication and division, etc., then the child no longer needs to work with empirically observed sets, like the set of 4 fingers and the set of 5 fingers, right? But once the child understands the concepts of numbers and addition and multiplication, the child no longer needs to work with empirically observed sets of objects like marbles to know things. The mere understanding of the concepts involved in mathematical statements suffices for knowing the truth of the statements. And it is in this sense that mathematical knowledge is not empirical. In contrast, one can full well understand the definition of water and not know it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Right? To know that requires empirical examining what you already know to be water. And so I've tried to do here is explain the sense in which mathematics is not empirical, right? You might have to empirically observe your, sets of fingers or sets of objects like marbles and do some of that at the beginning of the study of math, but once you understand what numbers are and what the operations of addition and subtraction are, you don't need empirical observation anymore. And there's all kinds of things that you can know to be true in math without empirical evidence. And I think, and there's all kinds of things you can know in math just by understanding the concepts involved. And so it is in this sense that Kant thinks that math is a priori knowledge. I feel like, in a way, Samuel Jackson was working on some similar thoughts in his write-up. Where is the Jackson piece? I think I've got the Jackson piece here. Samuel Jackson writes, one objection I have to Kant is that synthetic a priori doesn't, or one objection I have to Kant is that synthetic a priori knowledge doesn't need empirical evidence to produce knowledge, says Samuel. Samuel says, although most of our sciences and mathematics are pure knowledge, we know that they weren't always this way. Science and math once had to be proven empirically, so Kant's last form of knowledge is not real because we use empirical methods to gain the knowledge. Again, I think this is similar to things that I was just talking about in my reactions to Budwani and in the issues that Budwani raises. I'll give you my response here, Sam, and this may be helpful for others out there. Look, Kant would agree that science and math contain knowledge that we did not always know. Right? Samuel, you wrote, although most of our sciences and mathematics are pure knowledge, we know that they weren't always this way. I think Kant would agree that, we did not always know the truths of science and math. But in defense of Kant, it doesn't follow from this that the truths of math and science, or at least it doesn't follow from this, that the truths of math once had to be proven empirically. As I said in my response to Budwani, you may need to empirically work with and count and add sets of objects to initially grasp the concepts of numbers and addition and subtraction. However, once you grasp the concepts of numbers and these operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, etc., once you grasp those concepts, you don't any longer need empirical evidence to know things like 1,253,268 minus 75,906 equals 1,177,362. I can know that that's true without empirically counting up massive sets of objects to figure it out, right? We can make the calculations just using our understanding of the concepts of 1,253,268 and 75,906, right? And we can make the calculations using our understanding of those two numbers and using our understanding of subtraction. We can make the calculations, right, without actually having to empirically test our conclusion by counting out over 1 million objects and over 75,000 objects, etc. Right, and it's in this sense that mathematical knowledge is not empirically based, right? You may, right, to initially understand the concepts of numbers as a child, to initially understand the concepts and to initially understand what addition and subtraction involves, you might have to, work with some objects and count them out. Here's, right, 4 fingers and 5 fingers, there's 9 fingers. Oh, I subtract 4, what am I left with? Now I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I might have to start out doing things that way, but once I grasp the notions and the concepts of numbers, and I grasp addition and subtraction, I don't have to do that anymore to know mathematical truths. And in that sense, math is a priori. So that's what I want to say in Kant's defense here. These were some interesting responses. I don't have more to say. Let us go on to talk about the first part of the main transcendental question. And I do think the main transcendental question of the Prolegomena is whether metaphysical knowledge is possible. Let us turn to the main transcendental question and the first part, where Kant tells us more about how mathematics as synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. And, this is an interesting part of the Prolegomena for several reasons. For one reason, we get our first introduction to Kant's discussion of the phenomenal and noumenal worlds, and we get to hear Kant say some interesting things about the very nature of space and time. But let's do a bit of review. Maybe I've already covered this review earlier, but I'm going to my outline. I don't know how much I will have to add to my outline, but let's walk through this. Recall that Kant takes issue with Hume's critique of the traditional or school metaphysics. Hume's critique rests on the presumption that all knowledge is either relations of ideas, that's what Kant calls analytic a priori knowledge, or matters of fact, and that's what Kant calls synthetic a posteriori knowledge. But Kant argues against Hume that this is mistaken. Kant says mathematics and geometry give us synthetic a priori knowledge. Synthetic a priori knowledge would be non-definitional knowledge that reveals truths that are not just about the content of our concepts, but truths about the world which can be known without empirical evidence. If there is metaphysical knowledge, it would be synthetic a priori knowledge. Right? To claim that God exists. This isn't some analytic truth, or the claim that we have immortal souls. This is not some analytic truth. Right? So Kant proposes to examine what allows for synthetic a priori knowledge in math and geometry. The idea here for Kant is that by examining what allows for the synthetic a priori knowledge of math and geometry, we might find out whether the conditions which allow for such knowledge in those fields of math and geometry, we might find out whether those conditions will allow us to have synthetic a priori knowledge in metaphysics, right? So the idea here is Kant wants to examine how we get synthetic a priori knowledge in math and geometry, right? Right, and the idea is let's figure out the conditions that allow for synthetic a priori knowledge in math and geometry, and by learning the conditions that allow for that, would those conditions conceivably be met in the realm of metaphysics, right? It's an interesting procedure. So let's talk about space and time in math and geometry. Kant talks about these in the reading for today. If math and geometry yield synthetic knowledge, then they cannot just reveal the contents of our concepts. Right? They must say true things about reality that go beyond the mere analysis of concepts. In the reading, Kant says that geometry tells us things about space, and mathematics tells us things about time. According to Kant, geometry uncovers the rules of spatial organization, and mathematics uncovers the rules of temporal, time-based organization. Let me elaborate on this further. Seems to me what Kant is getting at is something like this regarding geometry. Consider that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle always add to 180 degrees. Right? This truth reflects the fact that no triangle can be constructed, can be built, without meeting this condition. Right? Another truth of geometry is that, right, on a plane surface, parallel lines never intersect. This means that we can never construct parallel lines that do intersect, right? These truths of geometry tell us things about what must be the case anytime we construct a triangle, or what must be the case anytime we construct parallel lines, right? And I think as well, for Kant, when we are processing empirical data that comes to us through our senses, for Kant, when we're processing empirical data, our mind is involved in a kind of construction, right? So when I observe what I take to be a triangle, empirical data comes to me, and I construct that data as a triangle. And anytime within my mind I'm constructing the empirical data as a triangle, then my mental observation of what I call a triangle must include 180 degrees as the sum of the interior angles of that mental construct I, I produce of a triangle when I'm observing what I refer to as a triangle, right? And so, what Kant is suggesting in part here is that the rules of our spatial experience must follow the rules of geometry, right? And so if I'm processing empirical data in the observation of what I take to be parallel lines, well, according to the rules of geometry, if I'm observing what I take to be parallel lines, I must construct my experience in such a way that those parallel lines never intersect. And that's just a rule of how our minds organize spatial experience, right? And geometry articulates the rules by which our minds organize spatially observed data. And it's going to be similar things that Kant wants to say about mathematical knowledge. Mathematical knowledge for Kant involves articulating the rules for our temporal, our time-based experiences. So regarding math, I give the example that for any number set, right, for any number set A, number set B, and number set C, if if set A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then set A must be greater than C. This is a property of mathematics. And this truth reflects the fact that in a time sequence, if event A runs longer than event B, and if event B runs longer than event C, then it must be that event A runs longer than event C, right? And this is a necessary property of time sequences that when, for instance, suppose I'm watching right, Gone with the Wind, and if Gone with the right, if that event of my watching Gone with the Wind runs longer than the event of my watching the movie Annie Hall, and if my event of watching the movie Annie Hall runs longer than my experience of watching some other movie, well, then my experience of watching the movie Gone with the Wind must run longer than my experience of the last movie, which was shorter than Annie Hall, and Gone with the Wind was longer than my experience of Annie Hall, etc. But regardless, the idea here is that mathematics gives us the rules for the construction of our time-based experience, etc., according to Kant. So Kant thinks that, I'm moving on to space and time as forms of intuition. So Kant thinks that math and geometry provide synthetic truths about space and time, right? These are not analytic truths, according to Kant, and I think I've spoken enough about that last time and in some of my responses to criticisms today, right? So math and geometry provide synthetic truths; they're not definitional truths. But Kant also says that the knowledge in math and geometry also produces necessary truths, not contingent truths, right? And this means that the synthetic knowledge in math and geometry, since the math and geometry, Kant also says, is a priori and not grounded on empirical evidence, since the synthetic knowledge that's found in math and geometry is not grounded on empirical evidence, and since it is not analytic either, Kant says it must be that the synthetic a priori knowledge of math and geometry, what must be going on here is it must reveal the ways in which space and time must operate. So, right? So, Kant wants to say that, look, we've got synthetic a priori knowledge in math and geometry, and it's not contingent. It's not revealing contingent truths. It's revealing necessary truths. And so what Kant wants to do is Kant wants to say that space and time must then be revealing. It must be revealing the necessary rules by which our spatial and time-based experience must operate. Right? So, for instance, right? Look, it's inconceivable that I could construct in my experience that I could construct the experience of a triangle in which the triangle's sum of the interior angles does not equal 180 degrees, or right, and so it's a necessary truth about triangles that their sum of the interior angles equals 180 degrees, and this necessity is expressed in the fact that I cannot mentally construct a triangle where the sum of the interior angles is any different, right? Analogously, I cannot construct an experience of parallel lines on a plane surface in which they ever intersect. These are just the rules of spatial experience that establish necessities about how our spatial experience must be organized, and similar claims could be made about some of our time-based experience, right? But the question could be raised: how is such synthetic, non-empirical knowledge of necessary truths possible? Right? How is it possible for us to have this synthetic, a priori, non-empirical knowledge of necessary truths? Seems to me what Kant wants to say in the reading is that this is possible only insofar, right, I'm going back to the outline. Kant says this is possible only insofar as it is understood that space and time have no existence external to consciousness, have no existence external to the mind, but rather space and time exist only within the mind. Kant believes that if space and time were outside of the mind, external to us, then we could only know of space and time through empirical evidence. Thus, our knowledge of space and time, right, would have to be a posteriori, based on empirical evidence. But math and geometry are about space and time, and they are a priori. They're not grounded on empirical evidence. Therefore, it must be that space and time are not external to the mind, existing as empirically observable objects. Rather, they must be internal to the mind, so that we can have a priori knowledge of them. If space and time are not external, empirically observed objects, then what are they? Right? Well, for Kant, there's something internal to our mind, right? But even that's too vague. Kant wants to say that space and time are what he calls forms of intuition. By this he means that they form the ways in which our experience of the world is structured. Space and time, they structure the way in which we experience reality. According to Kant, we see objects and events in space and time, but we don't see space and time themselves, right? Here's my cup of coffee. I see the cup as a spatial object occupying a certain dimensions in space, right? But I don't experience space. I experience objects in space, right? And geometry articulates the rules by which my experience of spatial objects like the cup must be constructed, right? Right? So again, um, what Kant wants to say is that what makes math and geometry possible as synthetic a priori knowledge is the fact that they are about space and time, and these exist not as external empirically observable phenomena, but as the forms of intuition. They are the means by which our experience of the world is structured. Thus, by examining what makes math and geometry possible as synthetic a priori knowledge in the prolegomena, Kant takes himself to be revealing things about the very nature of space and time as existing internal to the mind as mere forms of intuition, which shape the way in which our experience of the world is ordered. Okay, again, it's important to understand that for Kant, space and time, they have no existence outside of the mind. Space and time order the data of our experience. And right, the data of our experience, they come to us, and we then construct that data to give us the experience of objects in space and in time. Right? Right? But space and time are internal to the mind, structuring the data that comes into our minds, giving us the experience of spatially existing objects like the cup as spatial objects, or ordering our experience of events in time, etc. So space and time, they have no existence outside of consciousness, outside the mind. Rather, space and time exist internal to our minds, structuring our experience as spatial and as temporally ordered. And math and geometry are just the uncovering of the rules by which spatial organization operates and the rules by which time-based experience operates. Now, I've got a little bit about Kant and idealism. In the later parts of the reading for today, Kant talks about Berkeleyan idealism. And Kant contrasts his own position from Berkeleyan idealism. Kant, for some reason, he doesn't want to be labeled as a Berkeleyan idealist. And Kant wants to distinguish his position from Berkeleyan idealism. Right? I have in my outline here, it might be argued that Kant's view entails that he is an idealist, like Berkeley. And the reasoning for this can be articulated as follows. Point 1, if space and time are internal to the mind, and if objects and events occur in space and time, then objects and events must be internal to the mind. Right? Right? For instance, I perceive the cup as a spatially extended object, right? My experience of the cup is the experience of it as a spatial being. But if space is just the way in which, right, I construct my experience of the cup, right, and if space is internal to the mind, and if the cup is a spatial object, then the cup would seem to be internal to the mind, right? If space and right, and so let me go back to point 1. If space and time are internal to the mind, and if objects and events occur in space and time, then objects and events must be internal to the mind. Point 2, Kant says space and time are internal to the mind, and that objects and events occur in space and time. Therefore, objects and events must, on Kant's view, be internal to the mind, or so it may be thought. This is idealism. So Kant is an idealist, is a Berkeleyan idealist. Somebody might interpret Kant this way, and Kant is aware that he may be interpreted this way, and Kant wants to say, whoa, wait a minute here. Kant wants to say, I'm not a Berkeleyan idealist. Kant wants to maintain. Right? And Kant is aware that that this possible argument and this allegation that he's a Berkeleyan idealist, this could be made about his position. And in part 1 of the Prolegomena, Remarks, section 2, Kant responds to this possible allegation that he's just another Berkeleyan idealist. And in responding to this allegation that Kant's just another Berkeleyan idealist, Kant makes a very famous distinction between what he calls the phenomenal and the noumenal worlds. Kant says that the objects of our experience, they do exist internal to the mind. And as such, they exist in space and time, and they are ideal. For example, the computer I currently experience myself typing on, and as I experience the computer, well, the computer, as I experience it, exists internal to my mind, and my mind constructs the empirical object of my conscious awareness in accordance with the rules of geometry. According to Kant, the empirically observed computer does just exist internal to my mind. Backing up here, the cup I'm holding, right? The empirically observed cup, for Kant, that exists internal to my mind. As empirically observed, it's observed as a spatially extended object that conforms to the rules of geometry in my construction of the empirically observed cup. Same goes with my experience of the empirically observed computer. It's constructed in conformity with the rules of space, which are articulated in geometry. According to Kant, the empirically observed computer just does exist internal to my mind. The computer, as I empirically observe it, is what Kant calls a phenomenal object, right? And there it looks like Kant's a Berkeleyan idealist. But Kant is not a Berkeleyan idealist because he says there must be an external ground of what I experience that causes me to have this experience of the computer, or that causes me to have the experience of the cup. There must be something external to my mind that is the ground of my experience of the computer, or that is the ground of my experience of the cup. The computer, right? The computer itself, existing external to my mind, is what Kant calls a noumenal object. Such noumenal objects can be known to exist as the causes of our experiences. But according to Kant, we cannot know anything else about them. So there's a noumenal computer existing external to my mind that causes my phenomenal experience of the computer, right? And there's a noumenal cup there's a noumenal cup that causes my experience of the cup, right? But my experience of the cup is a phenomenal object internal to my mind, right? Right? And then there's the phenomenal computer that's constructed internal to my mind, right? Right? But there has to be an external stimulus to cause my experience of the phenomenal object that is the computer. There has to be an external cause, right? There has to be an external cause of what I experience as the spatially extended cup, right? And so there will be a noumenal cup. That's the stimulus of my experience of the cup, external to my mind. But the cup as I experience it, right, is purely phenomenal. And the computer as I experience it is purely phenomenal. And phenomenal objects exist internal to the mind. Noumenal objects exist external to the mind, right? And the idea here is that, look, Kant is not a Berkeleyan idealist, right? Because Kant says that there is something, there is the cup in itself external to my mind. And there is the computer itself external to my mind, right? And that's right. And the cup as it is external to my mind is the noumenal cup. And the computer as it is external to my mind is the noumenal cup. But I can't know anything about the noumenal cup except that it exists as the right? I cannot know anything about the cup except that it exists as the stimulus for my experience of the cup. Everything else that I know about the cup is just a phenomenal object internal to my mind. And everything, right? And there will be a noumenal computer, right, that causes me to have the experience of the computer. But I can't know anything about the noumenal computer as it is outside of my mind, except that it's the stimulus for my experience of a computer, right? And so the computer as I know it is largely just a phenomenal object in my own mind, and the cup as I know it is a phenomenal object in my mind. And both of those objects are constructed in accordance with the rules of spatial organization articulated in geometry, articulated and understood by the field of geometry. At the very end of the first part of the Prolegomena, Immanuel Kant describes his position as what he calls transcendental idealism. So Kant wants to say he's a kind of idealist, but he's not a Berkeleyan idealist, right? And what does transcendental idealism amount to? It's the idea that objects as we experience them and as we know them as empirical objects exist internal to our minds. And the transcendental idealist, however, also believes that there are things external to us that are things like the cup in itself, the computer in itself, my hand in itself, right? Those things exist as well, external to the mind, as a stimulus of the world as we experience it. But we cannot know anything about the hand in itself. We cannot know anything about the cup in itself, the computer in itself. We can only know that those things must exist in themselves as the stimulus for the world as we experience it. Right? So Kant wants to say he's a kind of idealist, but he's not a Berkeleyan idealist. Because, and it's important to understand that for Berkeley, there is no cup in itself external to my mind. There is no computer in itself external to my mind. On Berkeley's view, the only things that exist are minds and their ideas. Kant calls Berkeleyan idealism, he calls it mystical idealism in the Prolegomena. And Berkeleyan idealism is not the same as Kantian idealism, because Berkeley doesn't believe in things like the cup in itself, the computer in itself, existing external to consciousness. For Berkeley, the only things that exist are minds and ideas. That's it. So, this has been a mouthful. I know it's a good bit to digest. Hopefully my outline is helpful. Reading the Kant can be helpful as well, but Kant can be tough. I know that some of you are baffled by some of what you're seeing. Hell, to this day, I'm still baffled by some of the things I see in Kant. But I hope this has been somewhat helpful in getting you to come to grips with and getting you to understand Kant's metaphysics and epistemology. Next time I give a lecture, I'll respond to some student remarks on this part of Kant's Prolegomena, and we'll be taking a look at Kant's views on causation and Kant's views on our natural scientific understandings of the world. And Kant will have some interesting things to say there as well. I'll see you guys. Take care. Keep in mind, papers are due this Friday at 3. Bye-bye.